Welcome into the Crime Beat here at Local 4 Plus. I'm your host, Scott Burnstein. Today, we're going to be discussing the unsolved October 1978 murder of Gail Webster, who was a manager of the Suzy Q restaurant, which was a very popular eatery on Woodward in between 12 and 13 Mile back in the 1960s and 70s. And Miss Webster, now we're 45 years removed. A lot of people that have looked into this case, including her family and reporters, have come to the conclusion that it's very likely that Gail Webster's murder was tied into the cover-up of the Oakland County child killer murders. I have with me today Terry and Wendy, who are Gail Webster's daughters, who were living with her at the time of her slaying on October 28th, 1978, 45 years ago this week. Thank you for joining me, Terry and Wendy.
Thank you for having us.
And we want to kind of deep dive this for the public. And I think that your mother's case is a microcosm of why we're sitting here almost 50 years later and we have no arrests have been made. There's zero accountability, both for the Oakland County child killer murders as well as your mother's murder. And we've learned via Freedom of Information requests, great reporting by the Detroit News and Marnie Keenan. We've learned in the last decade to decade and a half that there was a major cover-up in the Oakland County child killer investigation. And as we are going to discuss your mother's case, I know that you believe, as well as myself and some other reporters, that there was a cover-up of your mother's case too, and the cover-ups are possibly or most likely connected. I guess I would ask you to speak to that right off the bat, and then we can start talking some of the particulars.
Yes, Scott. Well, the timing seemed to really come to light after reading Marnie's book. And the fact that 76, 77, our mother's murder was 2 weeks before Christopher Bush was suicide murder, still being investigated possibly, I guess. But it just didn't seem like it wasn't a coincidence. There was something more to it. And then the task force was dissolved right after Christopher Bush.
Within like a couple days. And for people that might not know, Christopher Bush, who was found dead at his house in Bloomfield Hills, fall of 1978, right now is considered the top suspect in Oakland County child killer case. His existence as a suspect was buried for 30 years. We were able to find out about his presence via Freedom of Information Act searches, as well as reporting by Marnie Keenan at the Detroit News. Marnie Keenan wrote a book that you just referenced, known as the Snow Killings. Right, yeah. And Christopher Bush was the son of a very prominent General Motors executive, H. Lee Bush. And Christopher Bush, depending on who you ask, either committed suicide or was killed at his house in Bloomfield Hills. And then, as you mentioned, the task force was dissolved and there were no murders after this. But we didn't know who Christopher Bush was until I think 2009. But I'm guessing that the knowledge of Bush, the knowledge of who his father was, the knowledge that in the background of Oakland County child killer, maybe in the foreground actually, there was a multi-million-dollar kiddie porn, child sex trafficking conspiracy that these murders were a through line for. And I don't want to bury the lead here, but just for people, again, that might not know, Oakland County child killer case gripped this area for a 2-year period. And then well after that, between 1976 and 1978, there were 4 children that were kidnapped and murdered. All of them taken kind of in proximity to Woodward Avenue, going south to north between February of 76 and I believe March of 77. The first abduction was in Ferndale. Second abduction was in Royal Oak. Third abduction was in Berkeley. And the fourth abduction was in Birmingham. One of the victims, Joe Robinson, was discovered within walking distance of the apartment off of I-75. Lived in the Somerset Apartments. Your mother, Gail Webster, 48 years old. You guys were in your 20s, living at the Somerset Apartments in Troy. Right. And on October 28th, 1978, you came home after a night on the town and found your mother bludgeoned to death.
Correct.
Talk about, I guess, the discovery and then what everybody was thinking at that time and then what law enforcement was doing at that time to try to solve it.
Well, initially, in the investigation, one of the strongest issues was her being nervous about this gentleman who had been a customer at the restaurant, but also they interacted.
They dated.
They went out 3, 4, or 5 times at one point, but
he liked her. He was smitten with her.
Yes. He was attracted to her, and he was at ATF.
His name was Bob Van Hengel.
Correct. Lived in Huntington Woods.
Right now, Troy police, even though he's dead, he's been dead for almost 17 years.
I think, 09.
He's considered the top suspect in your mother's case.
Yes, he is.
By Troy police. At what point do you think that the law enforcement zeroed in on him as a suspect in your mom's case? One thing we should mention is that Bob Van Hengel, while he was active in the ATF, had found his way into the Oakland County child killer investigation as a suspect.
Correct. He was turned in as a suspect by 2 or 3.
There were three tips.
3 tips. Okay. Well, as far as we know, Troy did not even contact him until 3 days, 2-3 days after our mom's murder. And one of the investigators told us that when he called Bob and said that he wanted to speak to him about Gail Webster, Bob's first remark was, "Oh, well, what did she do now?"
So he was feigning that he had no idea that she had passed away, and they had contacted him like 48 hours after.
Correct.
Well, I guess the belief, if you think that he was involved in it, was that he would be feigning that he had no knowledge of it, right. That she was even dead.
Right. And that's the story they gave us. Who knows if they really contacted him and didn't let us know for days later. And he did not appear at the funeral, and he never showed up at Suzy Q again. And several of the employees commented in the reports following that he just never showed up. And that was kind of odd.
And you worked at the Suzy Q with your mother?
I did it one time. I did.
And she met Bob Van Hengel at the Suzy Q?
Correct, yes. He was a customer. And he would come in his leather coat with epaulets and a pipe and think he was like Sherlock Holmes or something. That was his persona. And then he'd sit at the counter with somebody and their walkie-talkies. And in one instance, this one individual, she had a neighbor who was an FBI agent, and she was relaying the story, and the FBI agent went, "We don't carry walkie-talkies." It just was a continuation of no information, bad information, being ignored, and
there was a lot of mistakes made with the investigation in terms of evidence. When you learned that there were murder weapons or potential murder weapons that you didn't know existed, her clothing, her gown, and her jacket were lost. Her robe and her there was a lot of stuff in the investigation that appeared to be bungled, whether intentionally or unintentionally.
It started the day at the medical examiner's office where they neglected to do fingernail cuttings and scrapings. And,
basic.
Yeah. So they forgot about that. So then they exhumed her in 95.
And while they're exhuming her, Bob Van Hengel shows up at the cemetery, even though Bob Van Hengel did not go to your mother's funeral.
Correct.
And that upset you when you saw, am I correct? When you saw Van Hengel at the cemetery as you're exhuming the body.
I pointed him out to somebody and asked, what is he doing here? And can't you ask him to leave? And I was ignored, dismissed, which is just a continuation of treatment over the years that we have.
And interesting is how would Van Hengel have known that
the comment,
Troy had, requested exhumation?
The comment was he had a friend tell him. Of course. So.
And somehow the clothes that your mother was wearing, the robe, the gown that was bloodied and had all kinds of DNA
contact,
was lost right away, or you didn't you didn't learn about the fact that it wasn't a part of the evidence locker until
3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Right. 3 years ago. That's when we found out they had a murder weapon, which we were never apprised of. And we also found out that the robe and or nightgown, they don't know where it's at.
We were going through the list of possibilities for DNA, being that it's advanced so much. And
we initially approached them to find a third-party lab. Troy actually looked at us and said, well, why don't you find the lab and then let us know who you find? So we had a couple of labs picked out, and they chose a lab in Florida. So again, we didn't get what we had asked for. And they only sent certain things, which come to find out Michigan State had probably over-tested a couple of the items. So they were probably so tested there was nothing left to test because the lab couldn't find anything.
So your mother's murder occurs, like we said, in the same time period as Christopher Bush dies and the OCCK murders stop. But Van Hengel had been, that there had been 3 tips called in about Van Hengel. One of them was related to allegedly some child porn being found on his boat. He was someone who liked to be on the water, had a boat that was moored at St. Clair Shores Yacht Club.
Right next to Sinbad's.
And in fact, his alibi on the night of your mother's slaying was that he, according to what he told police, he was at the yacht club and then had drinks at Sinbad's. But I want to ask you, that flies in the face of what he had told your mother, that he was working that night and doing a drug bust or a drug raid.
That's what she
at
told me.
Crooks and Maple, which is very close to the Somerset apartment.
That's what she said to me as I was leaving, and she was quite anxious about it. And we had no idea on a lot of this background situation that apparently obviously was happening, but she was quite nervous about Bob being in this drug bust. And I just said, you're going to be fine, Mom. Just lock the door, and worried about her all night, as it turned out. And then...
and weren't there people at the Susie Q who were telling law enforcement that after your mother and Van Hengel broke up, that Van Hengel would kind of stalk her, would sit in the parking lot and watch her?
And we had no idea that was taking place. When he would come in to the restaurant, if she was in any way near vicinity to him, she would just get up and leave and go to another location in the restaurant in the back, away from him. She was definitely avoiding him. And obviously, she had some fears. And I think because she had been down on his boat a couple times, that may have been the start of her coming across some information or seeing something that she shouldn't have seen or heard.
And we know from the very early stages of the investigation, it wasn't a secret that the investigators were of the belief that some of the conspirators could be in law enforcement. It was something that was, I think, made public, that investigators thought that it was possible that someone or a group of people that were involved in the kidnappings had some tie to law enforcement. And Bob Van Engel was an ATF agent.
Oh, right. The newspapers thought that the kids were feeling secure, that they were with an individual that they could trust, whatever the title was, that was a trusting individual.
And there was a car that became kind of infamous in the OCCK case, a Gremlin that was, I guess, seen in Birmingham around the time of Timmy King's abduction. And you saw a similar car at the apartment complex as well as at a local bar?
I actually was meeting some friends then it was Piper's Alley at 16 and Coolidge, and a Le Mans Tempest type Pontiac, teal green, foresty green, aqua green, whatever, car came in the parking lot behind me and kind of just sat back. And I walked into the restaurant and came out a time later to go home and looked for my keys, and they were gone. And I got to the apartment, and my mother let me in. And I said, Mom, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened to my keys. I don't know if somebody has them. She said, well, I think somebody has them, because after we spoke on the phone and I told her where I was going, somebody came over with the keys jingling at the door trying to get in. And she was shocked and scared and said, who's there? And then they left. And this was 2 weeks before she was killed. And we changed the lock, put a deadbolt on, and thought that was it. But this car was also believed, I got the impression from the police from Troy, that it was a recognizable car to them. And then in the police report, the night of her murder, around 5:30 or 6:30 that morning, somebody had spotted the same similar car driving down Coolidge. And it was also interesting, Scott, to go back to Bob's reports, because when he was re-interviewed in 95, the report was totally different as to the night that she was murdered. He was down at the yacht club, but he made different stops on the way up Woodward and what have you. So the two stories did not coincide, as it turned out, down the road.
Were you guys living with your mother the 2 years prior when Jill Robinson's body was found close to the apartment?
I was not.
I was.
Do you remember that when the news was breaking that a body had been found off of I-75?
Yes,
right
because I
at the
always
Big
went
Beaver
to
exit.
up 75 and got off at Big Beaver, and it just always kind of creeped me out getting off the exit.
What was your, not knowing that your mom's case could or would play any role in this, what was your memories of that time period with the city being kind of on edge and gripped in fear that these kids were disappearing?
You know, it was concerning, but I was 18, 19. And when you're that age, things just don't, they're not that important to you.
The impact is
it's somebody,
You didn't have little kids of your own, so
right,
it wasn't.
So it was sad. I thought, oh God, that's really, yucky that happened, but it wasn't forefront in my mind.
I thought it was actually pretty bold for somebody for that type of action. I mean, to be so close to that
in broad daylight,
in a police station nearby, and wow.
I think that the investigators believed that was some type of message to them that taunting them
Exactly.
that we could leave a body within walking distance of the police station and you're still not going to be able to catch us.
Well, in some of the records of Bob's callings to the Troy police, they were on Wednesdays and Sundays. Isn't that the same days that the children were taken? Was Wednesdays and Sundays?
And
I don't know if there's any correlation.
And Bob
but
Van
that was
Hengel had a reputation, and I want you to speak to this, as a member of law enforcement that thought very highly of himself, someone who had a lot of confidence in his ability as a crime buster, somebody that would, I guess, sometimes dismiss other members of law enforcement that had input or insight. He always knew better. He always was the smartest one in the room.
He was a narcissist.
Yeah.
He was a narcissist?
Obnoxious one, too.
Obnoxious narcissist?
Yeah.
Can you just talk about your first memories of meeting him and your feelings about him dating your mother?
Well, like I said, I met him a couple times just to hi, and I kept on walking at Suzy Q. But when I walked into the apartment and he was sitting there and that gun was on the table, I mean, that just freaked me out.
He had a gun on the table when you...
Yeah, and he's like, well, I'm a FBI and I have to carry this with me at all times. And I'm just, I mean, there you go, the obnoxious.
And he wasn't, well, by the way, he wasn't FBI.
I know.
And there were a number of occasions where we found out through investigating him that he had lied about what agency he worked for. He had told people that he worked for the FBI. I know he had told other people that he was a U.S. Marshal when he was involved in an undercover operation, and it actually got him. He wasn't. He was never censured for wrongdoing, but he was investigated for wrongdoing for lying about being a U.S. Marshal when he wasn't.
To a judge.
One of the
To a judge.
Yeah, right. Yeah. One of the detectives, I'm not sure if we can say names, when they were interviewing Van Hengel, he indicated to me he's nothing but a clerk. I was like, what? He says, yeah, he's a clerk.
You mean they said that he wasn't really an active agent? He was just a guy that worked in, he swept up at the office.
Yeah.
He answered the phone. But
yet here they're interviewing him and they want to get DNA. And he kept stalling. And then finally he said, well, you have to contact my attorney. And this detective just gave up. I mean, just didn't.
So initially they asked him to take a polygraph, and he said he was nervous about taking a polygraph, but he would give them DNA. And then they made the arrangements for him to give the DNA, and he balked and went back on his word and told them to contact his attorney, and then had no more discussions about providing a polygraph or DNA.
Correct.
But apparently, Troy police did get DNA when
he died, right?
When he died.
He was getting cancer treatments.
Right.
They got it from the hospital.
Correct. But there was also a report handwritten from MSP regarding testing at Quantico. And Quantico said, well, the tissue was put into the wrong formula, and so we can't do DNA on it. And they had written this report, and I said, isn't there any formal letter on a letterhead from Quantico saying that they actually did report, these findings, and not just some handwritten letter faxed over to Troy? And it's just like, how would they not know how the procedure and the process to go through to get DNA the proper way?
Right.
And then to have it properly communicated on a professional letterhead. So just another frustrating, can you get it right? And Wendy actually found pictures of Bob from a photographer on Google or Flickr. And gosh darn, if the picture...
You look at the composite from a sketch artist that talked to a witness that had seen Timmy King's abduction from what is now a Kroger on 15 and Woodward.
Correct.
Back then, it was another grocery store, and attached to it was a pharmacy called Hunter Maple Pharmacy. And that's where Timmy King was and was abducted from the parking lot. And a composite was put together from a witness who had seen one of the people or the person that had lured Timmy King into the car. And if you look at that composite photo, we're going to flash it right now. If you look at that composite photo and you look at Bob Van Hengelen at the same time, there's a resemblance.
When I saw those pictures, I immediately copied them and sent them to Terry. And I'm like, oh my God, look at the pictures. He looks just like the composite. And usually composites are not like really too accurate, but boy, this one was pretty much spot on.
And Van Hengelen, we should point out, lived off Woodward. All these abductions happened off Woodward. Van Hengelen lived in Pleasant Ridge, right off Woodward.
In a big house.
Yes. I want to take a step back and get away from the investigation, get away from the murder, and just talk about your mother as a person and your childhood and your feelings on just who your mother was, and tell the people, you know, about your mom and about growing up with your mother.
Oh, she was talented and energized. She was the all-American mom. Loved to cook, loved to sew, loved her family, and garden, and meals were just real important, and holidays and birthdays, and she was wise. I always thought there was a wisdom about her, and very common sense. And she always said, I wish times were back in the 50s when a handshake meant something. She wasn't real comfortable in navigating through, controversies and the all-American changing lifestyle, I guess I would say. So,
yeah. She was very loving, funny. And our dad bowled on Wednesdays, and she would take us to the Clock restaurant, and that was just the cat's meow. I mean, we can have pancakes for dinner.
So some of these references, you know, for the Metro Detroiters that are watching this, there's a lot of nostalgia here. The Susie Q, the Clock, these are all before my time, but I've heard about them. They were staples of Metro Detroit in terms of where you went to eat.
Mavericks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But your mom, from what I can understand, she was like the motor or the engine at the Susie Q. She ran the place. The place couldn't run as efficiently as it did without your mother's oversight.
She clicked with all ages. If you were 15, 16, or if you were 65, 70, she just had a warmth and a way of, and she cared. She was very caring. But, you know, if you were on your day off and you were heading out to, you know, have some beers with your friends and she needed a cook, they would come in. Okay, Mrs. Webster, I'll come in and cover for you.
And for people that might not remember or know, the Susie Q was known for their fish and chips, their fried chicken. They were incredibly popular. They began to franchise the business out in Metro Detroit, and with the goal of franchising it nationwide, and it never really picked up steam. The other outlets they put around Metro Detroit didn't have the success or the popularity that the one on Woodward did.
Right.
But it was something that it was like a place that everybody went with their family.
Right.
It was.
Midnight Mass, after Midnight Mass.
Which is what, because it was right next to the Shrine of the Little Flower.
Correct.
Right.
One of my fondest memories is she would let us skip school and take us down on the train and from Royal Oak down to J.L. Hudson's, and we'd see Santa. So that was
and the old rotunda that burned down in Dearborn. They're one of the first Santas. I think that was in the Detroit area. Whatever was happening, going to see The Sound of Music, just always.
When did your mom and dad split up?
75.
75, about almost 3 years. prior.
So there was an adjustment period where your mom moves into an apartment and she begins dating again. How did that play out? How did that make you guys feel? And
Didn't bother me. You know, we had issues with our father. And there was some anger there against him, towards him, not with mom. I mean, my attitude at the time was, you know, don't stop living just because, you know, you got divorced. And it took her a little while. Like I said, she only went out with Bob a couple times, 3 or 4 times. But then she met this one gentleman, Tom, and that was over a year and a half. And they had fun together. They had a good time together.
he was going to ask her to marry him, right?
I don't know. I don't know about that.
Well, that's what he told people, I guess.
He?
Well,
It was in one of the Troy reports. I don't know if you saw it. But
Okay.
I wasn't aware of that.
okay.
His former wife got married that morning.
Yeah. That
she was-
very
But we should also mention that your father was interviewed by police, and when any wife or ex-wife
Sure.
dies under suspicious circumstances or foul play, the husband is automatically going to be looked at as a potential suspect. But they eliminated your father pretty quickly. He had an airtight alibi, and he said, although he was very upset about the divorce and still loved your mom and was jealous that your mom was dating, it wasn't, I think what he said to the police, it wasn't something he thought about every day. It wasn't something
Right.
he obsessed about.
He accepted it. I mean, he was seeing a lady too, so, you know.
But I just want for anybody that's consuming this and thinking, well, where's the husband? Like he might have had a motive too.
Right. No.
That was quickly dismissed by investigators.
And we never even thought, like, could it be? That didn't, at least it didn't cross my mind. I didn't think he had anything to do with it.
And Tom was also eliminated.
Yeah.
So
They all went through lie detector tests.
Right. That we should point that out. They both passed polygraphs. And Bob Van Engel would not take a polygraph. We mentioned that earlier in the interview, and would not give over his DNA. Talk about the move to Somerset. Was this something that your mom took a lot of time in planning? What brought her? How did she decide to come to the Somerset
the
apartments?
deciding factor was actually because of our father's issue. It was right after Wendy graduated from high school that the decision to split up was going to happen. And going back just on the history a little bit, they, as a couple, they were really quite dynamic individually and together. They both played piano. She always played classical and had a fabulous voice. And actually, she sang on radio on WWJ back with Don Large in the day. And our dad, he would always play the boogie woogies and what have you. And they danced. They won dance contests. And they were just a lot of fun. Just a lot of fun. And, you know, the sad case of my dad's drinking got out of control. And it just was the demise to our family, their marriage and our family. And he struggled with her for years. And of course, you know, closer he got into his 60s, he needed to back off and change his ways. But by then, of course, it was way too late. But nonetheless, they...
So where was the family home? Where did you guys
we were in
grow up?
Royal Oak.
So you went from Royal Oak, and your mom moved from the house in Royal Oak to Somerset Apartments.
Correct.
I think she wanted to try and kind of get out of Royal Oak a little bit. He was still living in Royal Oak. So there was just, I think, enough distance where she wasn't concerned about him just dropping in, which he never did. So that's, and there weren't that many apartments around at that time. And that's the only reason I know she picked Somerset. Other than that, I don't have a clue as to why she picked that one.
Was she friends with a lot of people in the complex?
No, she moved there because one of the ladies she was really good friends with, and her husband lived there.
Okay.
We were in the senior section.
Not a lot of parties, not a lot of late night parties.
No. In fact, I moved in first. I moved in, I think, right after graduation. And I had 3 months to myself in that apartment. And I was like, oh, boy. party, but I didn't because my mom said, you can't party. Those people were 90 years old, and they were 90 years old. So I was there 3 months. She moved in like in October. That's when she moved in. So it was an adjustment for her. I think she was very sad. They had to sell the house. She loved living, where we lived. But also, on the other hand, it was kind of a new beginning for her.
So let's now, get into, I apologize, more painful territory here. But let's talk about from the time the investigation starts and start going through the years at this, I can't imagine this arduous, frustrating, incredibly painful investigation that had all of these bumps and a lot more lows and highs. And what you believed and what a lot of people back you up on now is that people don't know whether or not, when we're talking about Gail Webster's investigation, how much of the bad police work was intentional and how much of it was unintentional. So can you just kind of take us through that journey of trying to find answers and consistently getting stonewalled?
Well, I think the unintentional in the very beginning, the investigating officer, his job at that time was to locate people who bounced checks. You throw somebody like that into a homicide, what do you think's going to happen?
He's out of his depths.
Exactly.
I don't think at that time Troy had a homicide division. So it was created probably from her mom's death, but it just had a feeling of chasing each other around, discombobulated, just unorganized. Who's checking on who? What do we do with this? In hindsight, some undercurrent was there. And we had feelings at times that, they're working on it. We're going to make some progress. And it would be like one step forward, two steps back. I remember in '88, I saw an article in the news about the new DNA testing. So I ran right over to the original investigator and I said, hey, now they have DNA. Do you think we could do some testing? And I talked to him and he looked over my head and walked right by me. And it was just another boom, slap in the face.
I mean, back then, did you feel in your heart that Troy was trying to solve this, or they were just trying to have you stop bothering them?
I think for quite a while we had confidence that they were working on it. There was a couple of detectives that said to me, I've got to solve this case. This case I have to solve before I retire.
So they were giving you at least lip service. They were telling you the right things.
I think after the exhumation is when I really lost.
So the body gets exhumed. You convince you guys. It's the impetus for this is from you guys. You convince Troy in the Oakland County prosecutor to.
No, it's just Oakland. It was just Troy.
Just Troy.
Troy went
to exhume the body, and this is in 1995, right when the DNA is. Everyone was talking about the OJ case back then, and that was the first time that the public really started to consume what DNA was.
Well, and I think the fact that we were stressing the fact that her nails weren't scraped at the original autopsy. So it kind of maybe put them in a situation, well, maybe we better go through this.
Which, by the way, they knew. They were aware that had not happened.
Because I asked them right then when they showed us, I said, did you guys scrape fingernails? And I wasn't even, watching all the crime shows like they have now.
There was no such thing as CSI back then.
Right.
Yeah, but it came out and no, we didn't.
And we should also mention that there was no signs of forced entry in your mother's case. She let the person that murdered her most likely into the...
Well, we don't know.
Either that or they still had the keys.
Right.
And then she didn't put the deadbolt on, which...
Right.
She didn't like
Yes.
the deadbolt. She was afraid it was going to wake up the people because it was pretty loud and clunky.
But
So-
nobody heard anything either in that apartment.
And we think that she was murdered around 3:30.
Correct.
And you found her when?
I think it was 5:30.
And immediately there's a crime scene unit there?
No, it took them some time to actually find Dorchester because it runs north and south of the complex, and they were up at the north end. And I was on the phone with them the entire time until they arrived, and they made it down to the south side. But it was 10 minutes, something like that.
But they were looking, I mean, as the years go on, they weren't dismissing Van Hengelen. They were interviewing him. They eventually searched his mobile home
Right.
And found what they think could be the murder weapon. And you had no idea about this until a couple years
3 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When just to let people understand why 3 years ago. 3 years ago during the pandemic, Troy police decided to open up the case file and go back in. And they contacted you and told you, we got some new information for you, and we have renewed interest in looking into your mother's case.
Right.
But then you found a bunch of stuff that was actually probably more disturbing than confidence building.
Well, on this journey of trying to find the truth and have justice for our mother, yes, we keep tripping over lies. It's just, it's unbelievable, really. Beyond disappointing and surprised. But you wonder, is this how it really works out there?
Now, were you guys, Van Hengelen died, I think, in 2006. Were you guys keeping tabs on him that whole time period?
I wasn't.
I called one of the detectives in, must have been 2003 or 4, no, 2008 or 9. And he told me, oh, by the way, Bob passed away. I said, oh. I was like thinking, and you didn't think about calling us? And I said, well, there was an obituary, wasn't there? And he says, yes. Would you like me to send you a copy of the obituary? And I said, yes, please. That would be nice.
And then I want to get your reaction to the fact that the people that he had entrusted with his belongings weren't very cooperative with police. And it looks like they cleaned out some of his apartment or his mobile home, his some of his personal items were scrubbed. It looks potentially like before police could actually get in there.
Right. And actually, I thought it was interesting that the individual that found Bob in his mobile home actually lives in the house that Bob used to live in over in Warren years ago. So I don't know the connection, but there is a connection.
You would think that once he's dead, people would, even if they were trying to protect him when he was alive, might be willing to
come forward.
Sure.
Yeah, but in this situation, it appeared that the people that he had around him at the end seemed to know that there was something that he wanted to keep hidden. Again, this is speculation, but we know that it wasn't cut and dry when they asked to get in there to look at his stuff. There was some delays, and then the police believed that stuff were taken out before they could get in there.
We were also informed, though, when the detective took the pipe out of a closet.
So that's what they think the murder weapon.
Correct. That they also said that he had grabbed some, what do you call them? Notebooks.
Notebooks.
We've never seen or heard of any notebooks. Again, the detectives on the case now literally said to us, we do not know when or how the pipe got in the evidence box.
It's tagged, but it wasn't initialed by who placed it there.
And when you're murdered via a bludgeoning, I would guess that the police psychiatrist that's doing a profile would tell you that is something personal.
Rage. There was,
Right.
yes, personal
Well, they
and
said from the
rage.
day one that it was a crime of passion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this pipe is not a real pipe. There's no threading on the ends. There are also numbers and letters. It was difficult to see on the pictures because there's like a flash. So there was a couple like little areas. And why can't they test those? As far as, was it a blackjack? Usually they're wrapped in leather, but if there's blood on it, they can just take that wrap off. Maybe there's certain companies that made those specifically for law enforcement. I mean, some extra questions, but they won't do anything.
Now, were you guys paying attention or back in 2009 when we were able to figure out that the state police had been hiding, I guess, some evidence, some pretty major evidence in relation to OCCK? Timmy King's family fought a FOIA battle in the courts for years.
I read about that, yes.
In 2009, they were given access to the file, and that's when we found out about Christopher Bush, whose father was H. Lee Bush, the chief financial officer of General Motors. And Chris Bush can be tied to a number of the OCCK homicides. And as we mentioned, he either committed suicide or was murdered. Officially, it's a suicide in Bloomfield Hills around the time of your mother's slain, and there were no murders after that. So did you have knowledge that the Christopher Bush angle was starting to come out, and that there had been these cover-ups? Did you think at that time that there was any possible dovetailing with the mother's case, or it wasn't until you read Marnie's book?
In 2012, there was a potential grand jury by the prosecuting attorney, Jessica Cooper at the time, and on unsolved murders. And so we were waiting to see if our mother's case was going to fall into that group. And as it turned out, the whole thing went nowhere.
And you also had a meeting with Richard Thompson, is that correct? The former Oakland County prosecutor?
We did within a year or two after our mother's death. And like I said, that we went there, and he did his best to just put up with us for a short time, and then dismissed us and told us that there were no mistakes made in the investigation. We don't have enough evidence. Well, of course they don't, because it's missing. So,
do you believe that Christopher Bush committed suicide, or do you believe he was murdered?
The latter. I just from what photos have been published.
It's a suspicious crime. It's a suspicious crime scene.
It's way too neat. I mean, I don't know how you could physically take a rifle like that, and
the rifle and his body were at strange angles, and they were able to also confiscate from his bedroom a picture that was drawn that looked very similar to Stebbins, one of the victims.
It looked staged. It looked very staged, I thought. And there wasn't much blood splatter, which I would think.
But in 2009, just for the audience to understand, that was when we realized that there was a cover-up at play here. And then that's been kind of playing out now over the last decade and a half. And I think that informs, tell me if I'm wrong, that informs your opinions about Van Hegelen and your mother. There's another tie that I want to mention, and I'm not trying to impugn the Cranbrook School, but more than one person that's been implicated in the child pornography ring, sex trafficking ring, had ties to Cranbrook, and Bob Van Hengel was a Cranbrook graduate.
Right.
Frank Shelton, who was identified as the financier of this child porn sex trafficking ring, was on the board at Cranbrook, had also been an alumni of Cranbrook. And he was on the verge of being indicted for his role in this pornography, sex trafficking, and he took off to Europe.
Right.
And as he was leaving, he actually wrote a letter to Cranbrook resigning his board position. So does that give you something to think about, I guess, when it comes to Bob Van Hengelen and the belief that there's some tie between him and Oakland County child killer and this child porn sex trafficking ring?
Yes, exactly. More involved than we ever had any idea years ago. I mean, in our mother's case, there were just a couple of small articles, even in the newspaper, and just brushed away. In fact, I think one of the comments Wendy got was, well, they were investigating a shooting that night. I guess the shooting trumped our mother's case. It's just been one thing after another that goes nowhere. That's just avoiding lying. It's become quite obvious.
And what do you believe? What do you believe the purpose of this cover-up is? I mean, you would think that law enforcement in the state of Michigan would be bending over backwards to try to solve such a notorious, iconic, slate of slayings that just rocked this community. But if you read the reporting that Marnie's done, Detroit News and the Snow Killings book, it looks like, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it looks like there has been major forces within the investigation pulling against solving the investigation or solving the case to protect very powerful, affluent, white-collar members of Metro Detroit that were involved either in major capacities or minor capacities in this child porn sex trafficking ring. Would you say that's accurate, my analysis, or do you have a different analysis?
I think you're probably spot on. And somebody said, if we knew who, that would be, why?
Well, so Frank Shelton was one of the richest people in the state of Michigan. He traced his family roots to the Alger family. He was practically royalty. And he owned or had access to an island up by Traverse City where a lot of these assaults took place.
Are you referring to North Fox?
North Fox Island. They were photographing kids, taking videos of kids, and then profiting from selling these images and videos around the country. And if you're just looking at the starting point, it starts with Frank Shelton. And I think Frank Shelton and who he was in where he came from and the circles that he ran in, it kind of speaks volumes. If the top guy in the top of the pyramid is at the highest levels of society in our state and our city, from Grosse Pointe, it's scary to think where other people play in the conspiracy.
Still being coddled, and the guy's in prison.
Well, Frank Shelton died in Europe.
I'm sorry, I thought he was still alive.
No. Frank Shelton took off before he was about to be indicted. Got on a private plane, moved to Europe, and lived in exile for 20 years. And I believe he died in the 90s.
Right.
Are you thinking of Arch Sloan?
Oh, Arch.
There are a number of people that are considered suspects in OCCK that are behind bars right now that refuse to answer any questions and submit to polygraphs or have submitted to polygraphs and failed them. And again, I go back to I think it's a fallacy to say, is it this guy or is it this guy or is it this guy? It's all of them.
That's right. It's a big, huge
It's every one of them.
Yeah.
Well, and look at our times today with the college situations on several campuses, and
We'll just hear University of Michigan and Michigan State, our two our biggest universities,
And we
have
get the Penn
been
State.
major sex scandals.
Embarrassing. Totally embarrassing.
Yeah.
Penn State, and then Jeffrey Epstein.
So maybe it speaks to the overall culture of law enforcement in Michigan and the being adverse to really diving into these very grimy, difficult to digest type cases, whether it be Nassar at Michigan State, Anderson at Michigan, or the OCCK in Metro Detroit.
But if you have somebody in law enforcement that's participating,
Possibly multiple people, and then
there's a wall.
and then protecting. Yeah,
right.
Wendy's point is about the protection that that they have. They can't be.
They can't be sued because of the governmental immunity.
Immunity. Yeah.
We got, there's a timeline. There's no timeline when it's a homicide, but they're saying, well, no. So there's no recourse. We're pretty much done. There's nothing we can do. The police department, they just go on their merry little old way, and we're left, still suffering and hurting like crazy because our mom's rights were taken away from her.
Where does Troy Police stand right now in the fall of 2023 on the Gail Webster homicide case?
We have not communicated with them since the results from the DNA came back
Negative, right?
negative.
Yeah.
And
we
we
expected.
got no call after it was in the Detroit News in May. So they haven't contacted us. And I don't foresee them contacting us unless for some reason they come up with somebody. I think what aggravates me the most is, and we're not the only one in this boat, the negligence that the police department can do and not be held accountable is
It's a crime.
terrible. It's a crime. It's a crime.
And we're sitting here now on the week anniversary, or the 45 years ago this week.
we buried our mom.
You buried your mother, and you have no answers. And you have no more firm answers in 2023 that you did in October of 1978.
Unless the Reuben nightgowns show up, because it was tested according to a lab report. It said clothes for stain being tested, and then we were told, oh no, it wasn't clothes. It was the towels that they were testing, because there were a couple towels found in the sink.
Why wouldn't you test the robe and nightgown?
Well, they were telling us that they got lost.
Yeah.
And yet in the records, it says that they had them. They didn't turn them into Charlotte Day. And actually, there was another item, paper towels that were bloodstained. They weren't turned in immediately with the other evidence. That followed a day or two later. And nothing was ever mentioned about the robe, the nightgown, or the hairnet, which was another contact by the assailant. So they did show us eventually a receipt that showed from the Emmy's office to the funeral home that her nightgown did go with her to the funeral home.
Like, really?
So, but the funeral home didn't turn that evidence back over to the MSP.
Have you talked to MSP? Could they have the evidence? Michigan State Police?
Well, I FOIA'd MSP, but I started out with a bill of $568 because all these pages I was anticipating, and it ended up about being cut in half. And then the pages that we did get, several of them were blank. Several of them were just repeated copies. I think I got 7 copies of one page. So no, we haven't.
Some names are redacted, and then they weren't redacted 2 pages later.
But no, we haven't approached them to talk to them.
Hard to trust them. Hard to trust any law enforcement.
So what do you say to the public, the people that are watching this, that want to help, that want to try to bring the closure that you guys have been looking for so long, and want to finally see some accountability, whether you're talking about Gail Webster's case, the Oakland County child killer case, how they connect, but I guess more specifically with you in your mother's case, what do you tell people?
If you have any thoughts that they may be the slightest irrelevant, oh, by the way, it could be something that really can tip the scales, because there's so much involved in our mom's case and in the OCCK case that it could just seem like the slightest irrelevant thing, but could really become an important fact.
Could be a tipping point.
Tipping point, exactly.
In the way that I guess that, finding Chris Bush's name in those state police files in 2009, we didn't know who Chris Bush was. If it wasn't for the King family fighting day in, day out at a cellular level for them, needing to have these answers and fighting in the court system.
Oh, Barry King was a...
R.I.P. to Barry King, and obviously Timmy as well. But Barry, who was his father, who was an attorney, spent years trying to get the state police to turn over what they had. And then finally, when they did and the judge made them do it, they didn't want to, we found out a whole other aspect of this case that we knew nothing about. So there's always, no matter how far removed you are, because in 2009, you were 40 years removed at that, or, at that point, 30 years removed, tipping point can come at any time. Wendy?
Well, I agree with what Terry said, but I would also like to see more accountability with Michigan State and Troy. Start looking in your evidence room, because they might be put in a different box, not our mom's box. But they haven't even taken the initiative to do that. I mean, Michigan State probably would have to have a call from Troy, but Troy has not even, as far as we know, has taken the initiative to even look for anything.
Did you get your hopes up in 2020 when they reached out thinking that this could be the end of the line, and then you're sitting here 3 years later and you're back to square one?
Deflated. Yep. Disappointed, deflated, and just, like I said, just keep tripping over the lies. You want to have some truth come out and have some resolve, have this thing solved, have some answers. The victims deserve answers.
Well,
and the families.
I can't thank you guys enough for coming and joining me and telling this story. I can't imagine what you guys have been through. I hope that when we show this and when the public is consuming this, as they're consuming it right now, hopefully they are taking everything in and wanting to help. And hopefully we can maybe get some tips from this interview. You guys have been through so much. Thank you for sharing it. Thank you for participating.
Thanks for having us.
I know it's somber, but R.I.P. to Gail Webster. And hopefully the next time we're sitting across from each other, we're talking about the solving of this crime. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
For Local 4 Plus and Click on Detroit, I'm Scott Burnstein.